Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Energy Newsbeat podcast. My name's Stu Turley, President of the Sandstone Group. Today is an outstanding special day. I've got a special guest, but first let me introduce my co-host, David Blackman. Not just a David Blackman, the David Blackman of the Energy Impacts podcast. David, how are you today?
The world is lucky there's only one David Blackman. Yeah, thanks for having me, Stu. I appreciate joining you on this.
Oh, we are going to have an absolute blast. And without further ado, let's introduce our special guest today, the one and only Doomberg. How are you today, sir?
Stu, David, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. We always have such great discussions. Looking forward to this one.
I'll tell you what, I do want to bring this up as our favorite green chicken for our podcast listeners that have not heard of this before. When we were at NAPE, we had a line of everybody that wanted to see when David was interviewing you live. They wanted your autograph. So you are very, very well loved in our audience here. So as we get rolling here. So we've got some things we want to cover. The China, we want to talk about your article, the gloves off, and we want to roll into minerals and everything else. So do you want to tee us up and really kind of go over your article here? First, tell us who you are, and then tell us a little bit about this article, Gloves Off.
Sure, yeah. The Doomberg head writer of the Doomberg Substack. We write 7 to 9 articles a month, and one full presentation per month for our approach here. I've got a really fantastic one coming out tomorrow. So this article, Gloves Off, we wrote this when we saw both what China had done with respect to rare earth export controls and the administration's reaction to it. And we have long been warning, as you know, and we've talked about on prior appearances, that China has selectively monopolized certain critical metals, minerals, technologies, through a variety of means. And one of the most important technologies that it has effectively monopolized, although not completely monopolized, is rare earth metals, and not just their mining, but their processing into a purified metal, and then in certain instances carried forward to make magnets. And what China did, is basically told the rest of the world that we have this weapon and now we're ready to use it. And the way they did that was basically anybody who has a China-sourced rare earth metal in it, in a product of any kind, even trace amounts, needs to apply to China for an export license. And so what does that mean in practicality? They won't sell you the rare earth metal unless you explain to China exactly what it is that you're doing with it. And then China decides whether they'll sell it to you. And they've specifically said that they will not allow export licenses for suppliers to global militaries, most notably the United States military. And this has caused alarm bells in DC. It shocked many people. I can't say that it shocked us. We find the timing of it interesting, most notably because, as we say in the article, after the cut to paid, the Chinese must feel that they are ready for a full-blown trade war. Yeah. Because this is a cannon that can't be unshot. And we'll probably hear about a great trade deal that has been cut when Trump and Xi meet. By the way, when we first saw this, before we published this article, we put a post out on Notes where we said this is economic nuclear war. The U.S. has no choice but to beat a temporary retreat. And China is sending a strong message to the global South that it is ready to engage in the next battle of World War III. And we have a mental model where we believe World War III kicked off in 2014. We can talk about that. And just one example of what this would mean, of course, is that China can decide whether ASML exports its lithography machines to the US, for example.
Yeah.
It's an extraordinary power play. It could shut down the entire US assembly line in a matter of weeks. And there's a variety of ways that China is threatening to do that now, which is we wrote about in the follow-up article. But it's, as we're going to describe in our Pro Talk tomorrow, the US, regardless of whether a trade agreement is signed or things de-escalate from here, and they probably will. The market today is clearly pricing it as though they will. Our sources in industry who interface with Washington are telling us they haven't seen anything like it. And the US is about to embark on a Manhattan Project style project, to basically rid itself of all China risk. That doesn't necessarily mean made in the USA, although many things will be made in the USA, but made outside of China in friendly countries. Friendshoring is going to be an extraordinary wave. And there will be hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars invested towards this end. We had one contact speaking with somebody pretty high up in DARPA. DARPA is saying we want to import nothing from China in 10 years. Think about that. That's the kind of like record scratch stop. Something big has happened, which is why we wrote gloves off. By the way, it's China who took the gloves off. The US has been flailing away at China for many years, one could argue, with semiconductor controls and all this other stuff. Only put the nice comments up, though, Stu, just to be clear. Anyway, and so it was an interesting article. It kind of struck a nerve. We got a lot of feedback on it. We stand by it, of course. And yeah, so here we are. And the things that we've been warning about, not just us, of course, but for many years, we wrote a piece called Geopolitical Warfare like 3 years ago, where we laid out how China, comes to dominate these critical supply chains, and they're not doing it unless they intend to use it. But they were very careful not to use it until they felt ready, and they must feel ready. Go ahead.
So in 2021, and you talk about, this has been an obvious issue for years now. In 2021, Joe Biden's handlers propped him up in front of his teleprompter and had him read a text about this very issue with China. And he declared it to be a national emergency. It said his government was going to mount a whole of government approach, a Manhattan style kind of project to free America from these supply chains dominated by China. And as far as I can tell, and I don't have the higher up sources that you have in the federal government, as far as I can tell, though, and I've asked the question of many, many people over the past 4 years, I can't identify anything the Biden administration did to actually make that happen. I'm sure they must have done something, but I haven't been able to identify it. And I just wonder if in all your conversations, you have uncovered substantial progress that was made during the Biden years, because I would hate to be saying that if it isn't true.
I'm unaware of any. I know the issue was studied and, internal analyses were done. The USGS put out, various warning documents. I will say, and I mean this in a sort of an apolitical, nonpartisan way, it is just objectively true that the Trump administration has far more people with business experience at senior levels embedded within it. And there's a huge chasm between, Chris Wright, current energy secretary, and Jennifer Granholm, career politician from Michigan, being your Secretary of Energy. Chris Wright, a serial entrepreneur, creator of a couple of unicorns, I believe, legitimate unicorns, billion-dollar plus companies. And they understand how industry works. I still believe the administration was caught flat-footed. One of the critiques we have of Trump, again, just by objective analysis, is that he always assumes he has escalation dominance in every negotiation. And there are two important actors on the world stage against whom he does not have escalation dominance, and that is Vladimir Putin and Russia in a conventional war, and Xi Jinping and China in a economic war. And so China, in this instance, is flexing escalation dominance, and you can tell by the reaction of the Trump administration. again, who knows what they'll say the deal is that they're going to cut with Trump touring Asia. But the Chinese would not cut a deal if it weren't favorable to them because they have escalation dominance. And they know it.
Well, when we sit there and let me introduce this next little article here that we've got an update from Scott Bessent when he was talking on, I believe it was CNBC. Let me play this just quick 30-second, and then we'll go into the next topic with Secretary Chris Wright.
Vice Premier Hui Feng is a seasoned politician, but it's clear that the momentum was with us. That when you get the EU, the world's largest trading bloc, when you get that deal inked, we had Japan, we had Indonesia, we had Vietnam. So not only did we have the EU, who has a very large trading relationship with China, we also had 3 of their neighbors. I think
that's pretty, when you sit back and take a look, they're in Malaysia. They've ended another war with the neighbors over there, some other places, and they're looking at this. Scott has been really working hard.
Yeah, I interpret the news flow a little differently than Mr. Bessent, who I must say is an intelligent person. And no, I mean this sincerely. He's clearly very intelligent. He's a successful hedge fund manager, far wealthier than I suspect the 3 of us combined by several orders of magnitude. But the EU is not in a position to exert leverage over China either. I'm sure that Xi Jinping is in Beijing shuddering at the prospect of Ursula von der Leyen's, revenge tour. And when President Trump comes flying into your country like Indonesia, of course you treat him well and so on. But Indonesia is clearly in the China side of the ledger, major coal producer, major player in BRICS. We note with interest, of course, that Indonesia joins BRICS, and then suddenly there's an attempted color revolution in Indonesia. Yeah. These sound bites on CNBC are precisely why we believe many readers enjoy Doomberg, because we're capable of seeing through that. But I understand what Bessent is doing, of course, and messaging is important, and he's a very good communicator and does very well on television. And that's not to be underestimated. I just think that they're putting a brave face on a situation that is quite urgent.
Well, when we sit back and take a look at the urgency on this, I applaud Secretary Chris Wright. I think he's doing a very good job in this, and I think that President Trump has got some misnomers or misinformation on the Putin thing, because I have been very vocal about saying that President Putin showed up to Alaska to do a deal, and he was going to do a deal by doing the Sakhalin proclamation. The only way to get the war ended is not by threatening India with sanctions or China with sanctions. The Dark Fleet is 1,600 tankers. Russia has a ballpark 728 tankers. They're doing quite fine with all the transfers going on outside of Malaysia. Sanctions don't work as intended, as Irina Slav says. But I was very encouraged by President Trump in Australia. I thought it was funny that the Australian ambassador to the U.S. insulted President Trump, and that was a pretty interesting exchange. But let's go through this next question here with Larry Kudlow, and let's get your opinion here.
Opening up Anwar, and I'll get to that. But everyone's asking me for an update on the rare earths because of China's blackmail. Front page story in the Wall Street Journal, totally about that. 3,000 words worth. Chris, can you just tell us what is happening on our effort to develop, produce, and manufacture rare earths?
It's a big deal, Larry. As you said, it's an all-of-government effort. We're making deal with businesses, small miners, big miners, processing companies, manufacturers. We're bringing in larger companies that can help bring manufacturing technologies to ramp things up quickly. But China went after this industry strategically to make us and the rest of the world dependent on them, and we need to break that dependence. And during the Trump administration, we will break that dependence.
Mr. Secretary, you know, I had some experience with it in the first term.
And when we sit back and we take a look, he gets into the timeline right about in here. I don't want to take everybody's time just by watching a Larry Kudlow interview. But when he does get into this area, he says, we would like to do it in 12 months, but we think we're going to hit 24. That's pretty aggressive when you start looking at the investments that they're doing, putting the processing in Australia in the latest deal that he did last week with Australia and the billions of dollars that they were doing with the subs and things. What are your general thoughts there?
First of all, I agree with everything that Chris Wright said in that interview.
It was a great interview.
Unsurprising. Look, we're writing a piece potentially here on Bloom Energy and shortage of gas turbines and you know, the data center drive and all that stuff. And the tentative title is Tlaib's Law, which is Nissam Tlaib had a really fascinating quote, which is, I've never seen, not all, it goes something like this. I'm sure I will, you know, get it wrong. Not all gluts lead to shortages, but I've never seen a shortage that doesn't lead to a glut. Okay, there will be a glut of rare earths quicker than you think. Yeah. Because of this. In 5 years, you won't be able to give them away. And the reason why we're writing about Bloom Energy and it's, you know, solid oxide fuel cells, which converts natural gas into electricity without a gas turbine, is because there's a shortage of gas turbines right now, and guess what's going to happen in 5 years? Yeah. and so, like, this is a crisis. It caught the U.S. off guard, regardless of the deal that is cut between Trump and Xi. The momentum behind what Chris Wright is describing is unlike anything we've ever seen in our time interacting with Washington. And it's not just going to be rare earth. Literally, there are people in DC who are writing down every American military dependency on China and actively working to move it to friendlier shores. So China shooting this cannon is not necessarily in the long-term best interests of China. The great, as we said in the Gloves Off, I believe, you know, we write so many pieces, I believe we use the phrase that the great bifurcation has begun. The world is splitting in two, the global south and the sort of Western-led G7 type, you know, 7 billion versus 700 million type square off. So Chris Wright is the exact person you want in that chair at this time, because not only does he have a visceral understanding of what went wrong and what got us here, but he's also got a proven track record of the ability to organize a proper response. And so kudos to him. And unlikely to be spinning things beyond what he believes to be true, because he's not a natural politician.
Yeah, he's the perfect spokesman. I read with great amusement the hit piece that was done on him by Politico 8 or 10 days ago now, in which Politico, based on nothing but bitter people inside the White House who are, you know, giving them probably false information, was saying Wright is on the outs with the president and his senior people because they don't like some of the things he said in the media. I got to believe that's completely false. Everything he's doing is exactly what Trump promised to do during the campaign. I wonder if you're hearing anything to the contrary on that before I go to my next point.
Yeah, it's not something that we would be able to have an opinion on. I do know that if he were to leave the administration, it would be a significant loss.
It'd be huge.
I suppose stranger things have happened. There are a lot of egos in Washington, D.C. And as far as I know, and my interactions with Chris Wright, limited as they might be, didn't strike me as a man of particularly high ego. And so, but, you know, we'll see. Nonetheless, the administration has many people of Chris Wright's caliber in it. And again, the real response that we're seeing is from the sort of defense side of the ledger, which has long been complaining about China's leverage. They saw it. Everybody saw it. Even Biden, like you say, in 2021. We wrote a piece early on in the Doomberg days called Magnesium PI, where we talked about how China had come to dominate that particular metal as well, which is critical for, you know, the automotive assembly industry for a variety of reasons. It's using an alloy, I believe, with aluminum. I'd have to go back and read the piece, but that was back in the early days. Don't go back and read that piece, actually, because it's hard for us to read our old work. But anyway, so, if he is on the way out, that'd be a shame. But I wholeheartedly agree with everything he said in that clip. That's for sure. It won't be a year, but it won't be 5 years either.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in the past, it's taken 20 years to open a new mining operation in the United States. If you can get the permits at all. Today, we had this news about JP Morgan putting $75 million into Perpetua Resources, who's just trying to open a long-standing mine that was first created in 1927, big antimony mine, another critical mineral, not a rare earth, but a critical mineral. And it took them 15 years just to get the permits to reopen the damn mine.
Yeah, we have an issue here, a big issue, not to be underestimated. But don't forget, the sandbox of response isn't limited to the borders of the continental United States or Alaska and Hawaii.
Yes, exactly.
So,
exactly.
There is a whole of Earth approach. And I think the deal, which, look, the administration is, Donald Trump is everything everybody says he is, all the things, right? And, but he's cut some good deals.
Yes, he has.
Cut some unique deals. The Australia deal was a very good deal. Even the MP deal that got so much, we wrote, a piece called How It's Done. I mean, we were like praising that deal, and that the shareholders got an amazing deal. I'll pull up on my Bloomberg terminal what the going rate is for a share of MP right now.
Yeah.
But I believe the U.S. got a bunch of, the U.S. taxpayer is more than doubled its money on that deal so far. And great, it's a win-win. The U.S. abates a risk. Taxpayers invest in MP. They don't grant MP. They invested in MP. They got preferred stock and warrants in exchange, struck at $30, I believe, and the stock's at 66. So there you go. MP is a stock that was heavily shorted, and we got a lot of hate mail when we wrote in praise of that piece. And I was like, tell me you want the stock to go down without telling me you want the stock to go down. That's one of the benefits of not investing in anything we write about, because then we're not emotionally tied to the direction of the share price.
Yeah, here's a bunch of hate mail in response to a piece I wrote about it too back then.
Yeah,
what was
one
it,
of those
May, I guess. Yeah.
We love Dave Walker. Shout out to Dave Walker. He is a cool cat. Also got a David Forsberg sending out a shout out, and he's watching as well too. So we're keeping the comments positive for you, almighty Doomberg.
Well, Dave Walker's a long-term subscriber of Doomberg and a frequent commenter, and so we love ourselves some Dave Walker as well.
He is a cool cat. It is a lot of fun. So when we sit here and we take a look at Russia and we take a look at I wrote an article just recently about the bifurcation of the world into new trading blocks. And the new trading blocks, as I see it, and I could be totally wrong, I'm seeing net zero as a total failure and deindustrialization, and you're either going to go down the net zero path of Canada, the EU, and the UK, and you're going to have more trade with China, and you're going to keep your deindustrialization on, or you're going to go into the new trading blocks. And I see India, Asia, and Russia, and the US in that new not green, but financially, fiscally responsible, using all the right forms of energy that don't need subsidies in order to move forward.
Yeah, there's a deal to be made here. I think Trump is frustrated with the Ukraine war, correctly so, I suppose, from his perspective. But the thermodynamics of the situation calls for the U.S. to cut a deal with Russia and cut a deal with China, split the world in three, and go about doing your thing in your own sphere of influence, which Trump is doing in the Western Hemisphere. Happy to talk about that, but we wrote a pretty interesting piece, and much of what we predicted has since come to pass. But the stumbling block is he just can't bring himself to meet Russia's demands in the war in Ukraine, whatever you think of them. And anytime we talk about it, of course, you get both sides, because there's so much propaganda around this issue. By the way, the worst in the world, we read everybody's propaganda. The worst propaganda in the world is British propaganda, by far. And so we wrote a piece called Mosaic Theory, describing what we believe Trump would do in the Western Hemisphere, and we predicted that he might have to bail out Malay. And so I'll read you directly from this piece, which came long before the bailout. When did we publish this one? September 10th. Yeah. We said Trump could help his beleaguered friend by leaning on Burford Capital. We have this lawsuit with, YPF, but the Trump administration may soon feel compelled to mount a rearguard action in Argentina on behalf of loyal ally Malay. This came on the heels of electoral setbacks by Malay. We noted with interest this surprising. Well, as we said on
better than expected.
Well, so we're a little suspicious, a little bit paranoid around here. We posted on notes this morning, Substack notes, that we saw that Vaca Muerta won the elections in Argentina. Yeah, it's funny when Chevron gets involved, how the election tends to go. And the same thing we noted with interest, how the president of Guyana won a landslide re-election. Exxon won that election, and so yeah, we look at the attack on, the verbal attack on Colombia, the Armada forming around Venezuela, the energy potential of the southern half of the Western Hemisphere is enormous.
Enormous.
We think there's 10 million incremental barrels per day of oil production that could be had. When you look at Venezuela, Mexico, Vaca Muerta becoming a Permian, Guyana, Colombia, Brazil with the salt, the salt deposits, and so there's huge potential. And already the Western Hemisphere outproduces the Middle East in oil and vastly outproduces the Middle East in natural gas. And so I think Trump would like to do that, but he's not in a political position to take the L with Russia, unfortunately.
What would taking the L involve with Russia, do you think?
I mean,
other than the Donbass?
Putin has laid out Russia's demands, the 4 regions, and a few other demands. Zelensky has dismissed them out of hand, perhaps rightly so. Who knows? It's not our country. And the Europeans have dismissed them out of hand. And the Europeans are playing a game of extend the war until Trump is gone. One of the things that we find mysterious about Trump is his desire to please people who clearly hate him.
Oh, I know.
The neocons in Washington and the European leaders, every European leader, all of them, hoping Harris would have won the election, and yet he has a productive meeting with Putin in Alaska, and then suddenly all the Europeans are in the White House, and he changes his mind. It doesn't. Again, it is what it is. You can't talk about this situation without triggering a bunch of people, but we try to look at it objectively. We followed the war very closely starting in December 2023 because of its impact on energy. I hadn't really looked at the issue too closely because I don't care who rules the Russian-speaking part of the Donbass. I just don't. Doesn't affect me. Doesn't affect my family. Doesn't affect my country, my state, my county, my hemisphere. But I started to look into it and started following the mapping projects day to day, and you could just see the big challenge with following this war is that people in the West are measuring this war in kilometers, and it's just not how Russians fight war. This is a war of attrition, and wars of attrition end suddenly. Who knows when it'll end, but when it does, it'll be sudden. And Ukraine was never going to be able to win a war of attrition against Russia. And NATO has, spent $100 billion in weapons, another $200 billion in support for the Ukrainian government, which I think you wanted to talk about, forcing function, which we just published. And so, now here we are, right? And it's very clear that Russia's, by the way, the demands that Russia are making aren't going to get easier from here. But anyway, I digress. Yeah, forcing function. Yeah. So, do you want me to just launch into this?
Yeah.
Oh, you bet.
We, the West, is 400 billion euros into this project. Go down to the next page. Ukraine needs 160 billion for the next 3 years, and that's basically
$2 billion between friends.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be fair, because of this proxy war, Ukraine has been destroyed, and the country, the infrastructure. By the way, and I say this as no friend of Putin, I think the wanton destruction of their natural gas grid and their water heating facilities and their electricity grid, they're war crimes. These are predominantly civilian targets, but the same time, we find the phrase war crime to be a bit oxymoronic. All wars are crimes, which is why we are so heavily against them. But they need 160 billion. The U.S. is not going to pay. Trump's made that clear. He's been very as erratic as he has been. He meets Putin. He's with Russia, and then he meets the Europeans, and he's with them, and back and forth. And suddenly he's laying sanctions down and threatening tomahawks and all this stuff. He's been very consistent on one thing: the U.S. taxpayer is not paying. Not even like, if you want weapons for Ukraine, you got to buy them, and Europe can't afford it. And so there's a giant prize that the Europeans have been eyeing for the 4 years of this conflict, which are the infamous frozen Russian assets that are sitting at Euroclear. And when we started writing this article, it looked like they were going to basically approve what we would call the seizing of those assets. The Europeans might disagree on a legal technicality. Essentially, the plan was to loan Ukraine the 140 billion euros that they need, $160 billion, and then only make Ukraine pay them back if Russia pays Ukraine reparations, and that's never going to happen. This is an example of what bankers would call a bad faith loan. You're loaning money to somebody that you know can't and won't pay it back. And so Euroclear, where these assets are sitting, is this really important custodian, back office. They hold people's assets, they settle trades, they move money around. They're the sort of the gears that make the modern economy work. There's competitors to Euroclear. Chinese have a version of it, but there's 38 trillion in assets sitting at Euroclear under their custody. And if their impartiality suddenly becomes in doubt, you could see some serious challenges. So as we were writing this piece, it looks like the Belgians have said no way. Euroclear is based in Belgium, by the way, just in case you aren't following this as closely as we are. And so that's been kicked into the long grass, as they might say in Britain. They've postponed the decision to December, but by December, Ukraine is going to be in a pretty sticky wicket. And 60 billion a year is a lot of cheese, as you might say.
Yes, it is.
And the Russians have made very clear that they view this as theft. That's just the Russians. That's Putin. If you go back up, that's Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov. Again, one of the things we find fascinating about this whole situation is how few people in the West even read what Russia's saying. Like, they put out English language versions of all the things that matter. And when you read their propaganda, you read the Ukrainian propaganda, you read the British propaganda, the Chinese propaganda, and ours, you get a more holistic view of what's actually going on. And if you just read our propaganda, you have no idea what's going on.
Idea.
That last thing I'll say, and so the interesting thing that we calculated in this piece was, I had a feel for this. I have a good feel for numbers. The value uplift because of gold's appreciation, that just take Russia's gold reserves at the time of the beginning of the war. So at the end of 2021, it perfectly offsets the loan amount that's being discussed right now, which, as we say, there's no coincidences. But so the last point I'll say about this is, next time you see like a big news event, take the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipelines, or who knows. Let's say Russia uses a wave of Orezhnik missiles and blows up all the bridges, that cross the Dnieper River in Ukraine, or some big, whatever's dominating the headlines. Find 8 different countries and read their official news service description of what occurred, and you'll be shocked. Just at the way in which the same event is covered in 360 degrees of difference. And once you do that once, it's impossible to see the news as it is presented in the West in the same way ever again.
Well,
really,
especially if you take the realistic viewpoint that our propaganda media is no more credible than that of Britain or Russia or China or anywhere else. I mean, it's all propaganda.
Ours is way better than Britain's. I mean, it's Britain is an outlier, but I get your point.
Yeah,
I agree in substance, but Britain, my God, Britain is an outlier.
Boy, I got blasted when the war came out. I was on a podcast and I said, the war will end with Russia having a land bridge to Crimea. I said that is what he's going after because he wants those bases and he wants the ports. And I said everything else is just going to be handed off, and he'll end the war when he gets that.
Well, doesn't Crimea go back to the reason you believe World War III started in 2014?
Yeah, but in the aftermath of Russia's
Yeah.
seizure of Crimea, the U.S. placed sanctions on Russia in a way that shocked the Russians, and Putin declared that U.S. treasuries were no longer neutral as reserve assets, and so he dumped them and he started buying gold. And China had been developing physical gold markets, and so you could see the beginning of the end of U.S. treasuries as the predominant neutral reserve asset and a replacement of gold to a role that it had, served for forever, basically. And this, of course, is the big threat. I mean, ask Gaddafi. And so that's when we think World War III hit off. That's that chart that we show in that piece, the value uplift of the Russian gold assets. In other words, what they have lost by being seized, they have gained an appreciation of gold. And then, of course, Russia has 200 to 300 billion worth of European assets locked inside its country. We read over the weekend that Germany alone has about 100 billion in assets. And if the EU goes forward with this plan, they'll just go ahead and help themselves to that. Thank you very much. And so, we wrote, in speaking of getting heat, we wrote in April of 2022 a piece called Crazy Pills, where we said these sanctions not only are not going to work, they're going to fail. They're going to backfire. And you can imagine the heat we got for writing that in the middle of, Ukraine flags all over Twitter and unprovoked attack and all this stuff. By the way, the reason we started looking into this is because again, I was like, it's not really our thing. But I saw this clip of John Kerry repeatedly describing the war as unprovoked war of aggression by Putin. And since nothing coming out of John Kerry's mouth is the truth, I started to wonder, let me go read the history of this. How did this war actually come about?
Yeah, that's when you know it was a lie. Yeah.
That was that was a tell.
That was a definite tell, yes.
Yeah.
No, Kerry should not be trusted with a paper opener. I mean, a letter opener. That man is absolutely disgusting, but we'll leave that alone.
We'll give him a ball of ketchup.
That was a great one, sir. I do appreciate that. When we sit back and take a look at ending the war, I believe the war will be ended sooner than later. I'm just being optimistic. I think President Trump, by listening to the warmongers, and I am not a Lindsey Graham fan. I think Lindsey Graham needs to retire, as with 95% of Congress needs to retire. So, Brett Baker has a funny line here. Maybe Trump has decided the fourth horseman of the energy dominance is the guys helping Ukraine hit the Russian oil transport. Almighty Doomberg. I usually say that Lee Zeldin and Doug Burgum and Secretary Chris Wright are the three horsemen of the energy apocalypse energy dominance, and so that's where I'm sure this is coming from.
Let me take that quote and point out something interesting about just how we view the world. Note with interest that Ukraine is not attacking Russia's crude oil production, just its refining, and China has excess refining capacity. 18 million barrels per day of refining capacity. Last year they averaged about 14. So just by hitting the refining, which clearly this means, by the way, the U.S. is like planning this and telling Ukraine what they can and cannot hit still. By focusing on the refining, of course, that's good because it doesn't spike the price of crude. But refining just means that China is going to be the contract manufacturer for Russia. It's not going to affect Russia's society, gasoline shortages, diesel shortages. Yeah. It's not like Russia can't go secure cargoes of diesel and tankers of diesel and gasoline on the open market. And so it's an interesting observation that they're not hitting crude oil production. They're just hitting the refineries. Why? Because they make big booms and great for media victories and things like that.
Wow. That's why you get paid the big bucks, sir.
You know, it's a free market, and so we get paid as well as our subscribers feel we deserve.
There we go. And we got Brian here. Brian is a cool cat. Drones have made the current war unwinnable, similar to the World War I stalemate. What will break it? No one knows. I agree, Brian. You are always spot on a lot of these things, but I feel that the end of the war is coming. And I think that Zelensky really is not the best leader at this particular moment.
So on the drone stuff, the drones, I agree with half of that statement. Drones have radically changed the nature of the war, but it doesn't make this war unwinnable. Russia is vastly outproducing Ukraine and NATO in powerful drones, helped by the Chinese, and the Chinese have cut off Western drone makers of critical supplies at just the right time for Russia. So we're seeing 600, 700, up to 800 drones in a single night. Soon, if you believe, again, you believe the propaganda, that the Russians will be able to launch 1,000 drones a night, overwhelming Ukrainian air defense systems. I agree with you that there will be no end to the war so long as Zelensky is in power. One wonders whether one of the things agreed upon in Alaska was that Zelensky needed to go, and Trump's inability or unwillingness to see through that, perhaps under pressure from the Europeans. I'm guessing, we're all guessing, because we don't know what was agreed to
Right.
in Anchorage. And last thing I'd say is your comment about Lindsey Graham. One of the things we find about the neocon crowd is they always assume nobody ever punches back.
Yeah.
And this is how you end up in Afghanistan and Vietnam, and and war after war, Iraq, Libya. We like to say Grenada doesn't count. And so, but here we go with Venezuela. I think this is the grand compromise. Marco Rubio, comes from the neocon wing, and can't really do the whole Ukraine-Russia thing much longer. But we can, as we say in the Doomberg,
Open another front.
Well, at the Doom Zoom we're publishing tomorrow, we're going to pick on somebody our own size. We're going to go down to Venezuela and crack some heads.
Let me ask this for you, Almighty Doomberg. And when we sit back and take a look at Venezuela and the Monroe Doctrine, I wrote an article and said basically that everybody was saying, well, what in the world's going on with Venezuela? Why do we have B-1s rolling by? Why do we have B-52s? Why do we have an aircraft carrier parked out there? And I said, because it is basically China has really stepped up. I mean, it kind of went away. China still owns, through the Singapore outlet, each end of the Panama Canal. That's still there. They have not finished that issue. And I think President Trump quietly is blaming the narco terrorists as he blows them up and go, look, it's about narco terrorism and the cartels, but it's actually about him playing more hardball with President Xi, saying, get out of my Monroe Doctrine.
Yeah, we wrote a piece on Inauguration Day, January 20th, called Misreading the Room. And the social preview for the piece was, if Greenland is the appetizer, might Maduro's Venezuela be the main course? And so this has been on our radar for a long time. And again, when you sort of see through the patterns, we call them mental models. Luke Groman and I were texting a couple of weeks ago, and he wondered whether the trade in Alaska might have been Venezuela. China gets Taiwan, Russia does what it does in Ukraine, and the U.S. gets Venezuela. Who knows? It's hard not to be too cynical these days. One of the things that we pride ourselves on is when we develop a mental model like that, it need not be true. It just needs to work. And if it works to explain events, we keep it. And once it stops explaining events, we discard it. But we've had, Maduro on the top of our leaderboard here for quite a while. And again, it's hard not to be cynical when you could write something like that in January and fast forward to October, and we have, the Armada. But as we said in that piece, the history of strongman dictators on the critical path of the development of oil, once the super majors show up next door, is not a glorious one. And we advised Maduro, I believe, in that piece that he should refrain from flying on a private jet anytime soon, because that tends to be a favorite
Oops.
way to rub such people out, if history is any guide. It's again, these are all very serious things, and we shouldn't really be joking about them, I suppose. Nobody's, just the three of us, right? Nobody can hear that.
Just the three of us, yeah.
Yeah, we're talking between us girls here, since we're all like, I've got my green chicken wannabe outfit. My wife goes, "Why are you wearing that Doomberg costume again?" It's like, I love Doomberg. Oh. So, when I show up to the dinner table wearing my Doomberg costume, I had to look like Barney for a little while till it got.
Yeah, they have to have fun in life. It is serious stuff, of course. But look, Venezuela's sitting on the largest hydrocarbon, reserve base in the world, and they used to produce 4 million barrels a day. They barely produce one now. Same, Mexico's cut in half with the cartels all up in Pemex's business. And so, when they say cartel and drug war, what they mean is oil and gas and energy. We all know that.
We're not supposed to say it.
Well, what do you see coming around the corner for the bifurcation and the new trading blocks? Are you really, am I barking up the wrong tree, or do you see that is where net zero is total deindustrialization, as we see Germany blowing up perfectly good cooling towers?
Yeah, well, I think the only flaw in that analysis is the permanence of the net zero leadership class. And I think once the war in Ukraine, ends in the way that we think it'll end, that entire class of European leaders are going to get swept out of power, which is why they're so desperate, I think, to keep the war going. They bet it all on this adventure, and when you lose, decisions have consequences, right? And so the rise of populism in Europe is a result of unpopular governing. It's called populism for a reason. And Macron and Starmer and von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas and Friedrich Merz and Daniel Tusk, all of these politicians will be swept aside in political revolution. And if they continue to resist the political revolution, then there will be a physical revolution, which is why they're cracking down on tweets and censorship and digital IDs and all this stuff. And so it's a race for Europeans, and I would call them sovereigntists, the Hungarians as a country, the French as a country, the Brits as a country, the Germans as a country, the sovereigntists within those countries who are fighting a civil war essentially with Brussels and the EU quagmire that they all ended up in.
Yeah, they all signed up for it.
Well, if you look at the history, it was pretty illegitimate, actually. A lot of referendums against it were just ignored, and they just kept doing the votes until they got the result they wanted. And then when they never got the result they wanted, they just discarded it and did it anyway. And they've done so much more than the treaties ever envisioned or were sold to their people. So I would say that the European Union itself is an illegitimate entity. And illegitimate political entities generally don't persist. They're well past their sell-by date, in our view. Yeah, we wrote a piece called Final Countdown. One of the problems is that we tend to be early on these things. And so when the news flow goes against you for 3 to 6 months before things really unravel, people say, you were wrong. And then when it happens, is what it is. That's one of the challenges of what we do.
Yeah,
it's almost like Secretary Chris Wright and the Qatar minister sending a letter to the EU saying, this is a huge deal, and saying, by the way, that the CSDDD-MOUSE is absolutely going to be stupid and we don't want to adhere to it. They kind of didn't word it very like, we're not going to play by your game. You can get cold in the winter. I would have been a little more abrupt, but do you think
very diplomatic letter?
It was very diplomatic. I would have been like, have a great life and enjoy freezing.
Yeah, so again, we wrote about this back in January, called a piece called Labor Laundering, How a New EU Law Could Rattle Global Supply Chains. And we mentioned Qatar's response to this. And at the time, the Qatar energy minister said they would basically stop shipping LNG to Europe then, good luck. And, and so, it's one of these things where one thing I find really fascinating, many things I find fascinating about doing this and observing the world, professionally now for 4 years, almost 4.5 years. Wow, 4.5 years, crazy. Is like people assume they have the leverage when they desperately need what you're selling them.
Mm.
Like Qatar could just not sell.
Yeah.
To Europe, just keep it in the ground. The price will go up, and the stuff they do sell will get the higher price. Like, it's baffling to me. Again, this is why we always go back to this amazing stat about the European Union. The Statistical Review of World Energy, which is our Bible, comes out in June. They've begun separating out the European Union as an entity across all of these magical spreadsheets that they put out. And you could just count it up. Europe consumes 38 exajoules of hydrocarbons and it produces 5.
Oops.
And it struts around like it has any leverage. Like, it's baffling to me. Like, Europe is a flaccid energy vassal.
Yeah,
By the way,
it's a
33 exajoules is roughly the size of the entire U.S. natural gas market. I think in 2024, U.S. natural gas producers generated 37 exajoules of natural gas.
Wow.
So Europe's industry tab is the cost of capital of every entity that touches every molecule of hydrocarbon that it imports, right? I mean, if you're going to build your data center in the Permian, that's one thing. You probably get paid to take the natural gas today.
Yeah.
Maybe $1 a million BTU on a 12-month strip. But if you're paying somebody to drill it in the U.S., a midstream to pipeline it to an LNG export facility, to an LNG cargo ship, to an LNG regasification facility, to pipelines, to your cement factory, your cogeneration plant, everybody who touches that molecule of methane is getting their cost of capital covered. And so you're starting out at $11 compared to 1 or 2 in the Permian. You're not going to win. And so, of course, Germany's deindustrializing. The fact that it's blowing up perfectly good nuclear plants is bizarre. Eugippius was out with a biting piece on this subject this morning on Substack. But again, we're long past trying to understand what Germany's up to.
Oh no,
It's like trying to understand California. Yeah.
Oh, California, that's a whole nother animal, sir. David and I talked about Alaska a bit this morning, and when you sit back and take a look at Alaska, that's all. I wrote a piece and said basically we are going to be watching who actually buys the leases up in Alaska because of its capital-rich environment in order to drill up there. And my grandfather was one of the chief geologist who discovered the North Slope, and I've gotten to hear over the years how all that turned around, and so it is expensive up there.
Yeah, again, we'll think that Alaska is on its way when the Ambler Road finally gets built. I mean, we're 55 years in waiting on the construction of one single. They're literally mandated by Congress in 1980.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
that's 45 years, I suppose. I can't do simple math.
Not quite half a century.
Yeah. And so when that road gets built, again, that's sort of like a milestone on the board. We wrote about it. By the way, if you're on newsletter.doomberg.com, you just hit the search function, you can see if we've ever written about anything. So if you just type in Ambler, that piece will probably come up. I believe had to be called Road to Nowhere. But I'm just going to.
That's a good pun. I like that one.
I'm going to guess. Let's see what it was. Let's see how my memory is.
While you're looking for that, sir, I love Rodney McGinnis.
Roadkill. Yeah, go ahead.
Roadkill. Rodney McGinnis is a cool cat. It would be interesting to build a roadmap of the influences. We'd said that, but I love what he said in the follow-up comment. The public needs to understand those influences. And I agree with you. That would be an interesting chart to put together.
Yeah, there's, having been in the corporate world, there's sort of clubs you you're forced to join as an executive because the company's already in it, and who knows why. And you go to these events, and suddenly you're linked to the WEF. I mean,
Right.
you could,
Oops.
but no, I mean, you could be. My point in saying that is, if there is some inner brain, it's probably a much smaller number of people than any map in the public domain is going to let you see. So.
Well, we're winding down here, Mr. Doomberg. What are your last thoughts here as we start rolling out of this?
Can I plug a new project that we've been
Yes.
doing? Yeah, okay.
Absolutely.
So besides Doomberg.com, you can also go to classicsreadaloud.substack.com, as the name implies. And one of the Doomberg co-founders and its editor-in-chief has started a fantastic new Substack. Classic literature, short stories, novels, novellas.
Nice.
Produced in the same Doomberg quality, and there's a surprising overlap in the Venn diagram of people who like Doomberg and people who like high quality classic literature and have well-rounded education, and we have a very brilliant audience. And so if you find yourself in the overlap of that Venn diagram, head over to classicsreadaloud.substack.com. I expect to see Stu Turley and David Blackman amongst the
Yes.
subscribers.
Be there this
here.
afternoon.
And it's great
You
talking
bet.
to you guys as always. And can't wait for the hate
And
mail.
we will, and Almighty Doomberg, we will always have your show notes in there and tag you and get this out there. Your YouTube views, even though we're now well past 19.5 million transcripts read this year off of our podcast, and 2.3 million downloads off of either Spotify or Apple. I have to get my numbers, but your YouTube, and I'm not real well liked by the YouTube folks, goes off very, very well on YouTube. So
Appreciate it. Yeah, I always enjoy speaking with you guys, and I think people enjoy hearing us shoot the breeze like we just have. So good deal.
All right, Mr. David, any last words?
No, I just appreciate Doomberg for being here. Thank you so much, and look forward to tomorrow's piece that you're going to have up.
Yeah, that's a pro talk, so you'll have to upgrade.
Shit.
You'll have to reach for that wallet and break open the spider webs. But yeah, we do have a premium tier. It's a little more expensive than just the articles, but we do produce some good ones. This one tomorrow, I'll give you a little commercial on it. It's called Mental Model: 6 Axioms That Explain the World as It Is (brackets for now), and we walk through our 6 operating mental models, which are just axioms that we graduate to that status because they seem to be working well at predicting current and future events. And so it's a good one. It's probably my favorite. I think it's about 60 slides long. It clocked in at just under 50 minutes, and we'll be publishing a free preview to our paid subscribers, and then our pro subscribers get the full presentation right away.
Outstanding. Well, I hope you have and I look forward to our next one when we start coming up with some more world problems for you to solve, since you are a great mind and you've got a great team working with you there. So we do appreciate you.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Talk to you next time.
See you guys.
Thank
Bye.
you.